There's a lot of hypes in this data center driving up earnings. I think in terms of IPP, the power producers, it's definitely a big boost. When it comes to utilities, it will depend on how, in the end, reliability and affordability, right? Because utilities earnings are predetermined by regulators. With the Microsoft and Amazon deals with Constellation and with Talon, we are looking at the merchant power plants. Those are non-regulated power plants. So you should not require regulatory approval for the rate structure.
Most of the utilities are talking about this increased in power demand, mostly driven by data centers, but also about some manufacturing in certain regions.
European utilities are they have a different business model in a sense, because they usually tend to have a renewable development arm, and they tend to have operations outside of Europe. So in a sense, they are very excited about this increase or potential increase from in demand from data centers and AI, which it's mainly focalized in the US for now.
Yeah, it's very interesting because, if you listen to some of the oil companies, there's so much talk about hydrogen. And then you start to say, well, no, wait a second, where's all this hydrogen potentially going to get used? Well, then it's sort of like the idea is maybe it's the utilities.
At this stage, we're only seeing pilot projects for industrial use. So we've seen a couple of co-located projects of green hydrogen production here in Spain, for example. Iberdrola has one where they try to produce. They're producing green steel. Basically, they're producing renewable power to produce steel. But this is a pilot stage project. This is still a relatively sort of a drop in the bucket, let's say, versus the ambition over the long run.
Some markets, not all of them, have capacity markets as well. So that's where you're essentially paying for the power plant to exist and be available. And Nikki, you mentioned that prices in the PJM capacity market had surged 10x. That's a big number. 10x is a lot. Can you explain kind of what happened? What's going on? Is this an enduring thing? What's your sense? Does the election really matter for utilities, or is it just some kind of thing that's happening in the background and utilities just kind of march on? So good morning, good afternoon, everyone. This is Rob Barnett, and I'd like to welcome you to today's BI Energy Exchange, where we talk about our research and the latest developments in energy markets. Today, we've got a little bit of a special conversation. I think they're analysts you might already know through Bloomberg Intelligence, but in case you don't, we've got Nikki Hsu joining from Princeton, and also her colleague, Gabriela Privetera. Normal guest also, Patricio Alvarez, joining from his usual perch in Madrid. And so today we've got basically our North American utilities team, our European utilities team. Jal Martins, who you guys all know, he normally would join this conversation, but he was called away for a family emergency. And so anyhow, today we're going to chat more deeply on the utility landscape in both Europe and North America. So I want to kick off the conversation by noting that utilities have gotten quite interesting lately. We all, I think, sort of appreciate the fact that solar, wind have been really increasing rapidly in most markets around the world. I think that really opens a lot of questions about what gets paired with that wind and solar. Is it natural gas? What's the role of nuclear? Suddenly we've got growing energy demand or electricity demand resulting from data centers, electric vehicles, all sorts of industrialization that's happening in the US. So a quite exciting time to be thinking about the utility landscape. So Nikki, let's come to you first, and just if you could, in some sense, give us your overarching view on some of the big thematic things that are happening in utility world. Does all this culminate so that utilities can actually make more money in the sort of ensuing years, or is this just more talk and less of an impact on finances in the near term?
Thanks, Rob, and thank you for having me. So I guess there's a lot of hypes in this data center driving up earnings. I think in terms of IPP, the power producers, it's definitely a big boost. When it comes to utilities, it will depend on how, in the end, reliability and affordability, right? Because utilities earnings are predetermined by regulators. And if the customer affordability is a concern, obviously their capital spending will be limited. Regulators are always going to try to control the affordability for customers, try to keep the bill increase to somehow close to the inflation. Historically, it's been on average 2 to 3%. So it depends on how the bill impact is going to be. So if we're seeing like right now, we're seeing already pressure on the electricity rates keep going up from the capital spending from the clean energy transition and the grid spending upgrades we're doing. So I think it's going to be a big concern. So it's going to be a big determinant factor. So it's hard to say, but overall, it's definitely a plus for the utility because increasing demand is will always help, right? Just how much it remains to be seen. Yeah.
Can I interject a little bit? And I'm curious to maybe get your read on how the data center piece of the puzzle feeds into that rate calculus, because it seems like, at least in some instances with say 3 Mile Island and Microsoft or Amazon and Talon Energy, you are seeing some specific deals for data centers that may be happening outside of the standard rate structure. Or you tell me, but how often is that happening? Are these sort of special one-offs, or are we seeing data center type customers going and saying, yeah, set the rates aside, we need power, we don't care about that conversation? Or is it more of a standard rate conversation?
Yeah, so with the Microsoft and Amazon deals with Constellation and with Talon, we are looking at the merchant power plants. Those are non-regulated power plants. So you should not require regulatory approval for the rate structure, right? So it helps in a way that it has less of the regulatory proceeding process. So it does increase customer bill, but it's most recently, for example, PJM capacity prices has almost increased 10 times because of the tight supply, right? So in a way, it will increase electricity rates for customers. But on the regulated side, the regulated market is different. If you have a high-tech company wanted to get supply for data centers, these are the regulated power plants that you are looking at, right? If you need infrastructure investments, right, that all need to be going through all this rate process. And recently, I think American Electric Power actually has a settlement of like 85% of the data center spending need to be covered by the data center, and they would also require certain type of protection for how many years this power is going to be guaranteed, right? So, and you're gonna see most of the regulators and utilities will require data center, the high-tech company, to come out with some sort of guarantee. It has to have a certain margin and certain length of time to protect the existing existing customers, because the current structure for this data center, they are at a much lower rate. Industrial rate is much lower than the residential rate, and there has to be protection. So so it sounded like regulated market seems to be more difficult because you have to go through all this regulatory process. But what we're seeing even on the unregulated, the regulated state, the merchant competitive states, in the end, with this kind of price increase, politicians, legislators, everyone is gonna try to challenge that kind of contract, and then we are seeing the Talon contract for the Susquehanna nuclear. It's already been challenged, so it's gonna certainly it's going to delay the data center build out in a way, but then there definitely is gonna be some challenge just to protect the existing customers.
Very interesting. I'm going to make a mental note for us to circle back around on the PJM capacity market, because I do want to talk about that. It's very interesting. But first, I want to get some of the other speakers on. So, Gabriela, let's come over to you. And by the way, for anyone who's listening, I am monitoring the chat, the Q&A, so feel free to pop in a question that you might want to pose for the group here today, and we'll try to work it in. But Gabriela, very similar for you. I know you cover a slightly different mix of companies. I know Nikki and you have the sort of territory divided here in the States, but you give me your sense. You know, what are the most exciting things that you're hearing from the companies you cover right now?
Well, first of all, thank you, Rob, for inviting us today. So similarly to Nikki on the regulated space, most of the utilities are talking about this increased in power demand, mostly driven by data centers, but also about some manufacturing in certain regions. We do see like those utilities in the US that have lower electricity prices are probably like better positioned to attract all these load. But then the problem that is not only the price, but also the capacity to serve these customers. So states that have like transmission capacity could probably more quickly connect if they have the capacity, of course, the electricity capacity, of course, to connect these customers. But at the end of the day, the regulators will also have to approve this capital spending if incremental spending is needed. And then it comes to the question, how do we make sure that is fair and that the data centers pay the fair share, and that the customers, residential, just like, Nikki and I here in New Jersey, don't get, in a way, penalized for these increased demand that requires more investments in infrastructure.
Can I ask a quick question? Because my sense, and I believe this is still true, but is it typical that industrial customers and commercial customers often pay a lower tariff than, say, a residential customer? Yeah, okay. So I can see why this is a political football of sorts.
Yeah, and it makes sense because commercial and industrial customers have like a larger load, like compared to a small household. So obviously the margins are different. We did like a quickly review of the margins for some of the Southeast utilities, and in some cases it could be at 50 to 20% difference between residential and industrial and commercial customers.
Okay, very interesting. We'll circle back around. Patricio, let's come over to you. I feel like the European story on energy and utilities is actually very different. Is any of this stuff that we're talking about here in the States happening in Europe? Give us a sense. What's going on with demand over there? Are your companies talking about SMRs and new technology, things like that? So frame the European utility landscape, please.
Sure. So I think one key differentiation that we can make is that European utilities are they have a different business model in a sense, because they usually tend to have a renewable development arm, and they tend to have operations outside of Europe. So in a sense, they are very excited about this increase or potential increase from in demand from data centers and AI, which it's mainly focalized in the US for now. We haven't seen any evidence or strong evidence of this like percolating into European power demand yet. But European peers like Iberdrola and EDP and RWE, they have significant renewable portfolios in the U.S., and they have been seeing signs that that this sort of congestion in applications for interconnections and for basically for renewable power purchase agreements is actually driving up the prices for PPAs for PPAs. So that improves the economics of their projects, and from that sense, there is an earnings impact there, and it also helps perhaps their pipeline of projects or the visibility for their growth, especially in the U.S. When we look at power demand here in Europe, the story is a bit different. So after the invasion of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, gas prices soared, and they have been normalizing, although they are still almost twice as much as what they were before the crisis. And what that means is that power prices in Europe are still relatively elevated. Industrial demand for energy has weakened, and it looks like it's weakening in a structural way. Like we've seen industrial demand in Germany sort of decline, and there's no signs of recovery in the near term. So we don't have that manufacturing boost that Nikki and Gabby were talking about in the US. That doesn't exist in Europe. So there is sort of signs of a few PPAs being signed by tech companies like Microsoft and Amazon and Google, but these are not going to they are not going to move the needle, I would say, in sort of turning the tide in power demand. It looks like power demand this year in Europe is going to recover roughly 2% after declining 7% in 2023. So it's sort of a subdued recovery. It's still almost 10% below what it was in 2021. And I would say that if you look at the energy policy for the EU 27, most of the growth in electrification comes from fuel switching. So it still relies a lot on electrifying autos, electrifying shipping, the deployment of green hydrogen, which, you know, it's still a very nascent stage, and looks like by all means is going to be a bit delayed until the 2030s if it ever picks up. So I would say that the demand picture is just weaker on this side of the Atlantic.
Very interesting. You mentioned hydrogen. Gabriela and Nikki, I want to come over to you on hydrogen. I believe NextEra is one of the companies that's talked about they have this terminology that I find a bit curious. So rather than net zero, I believe they're the one that says real zero. And I believe hydrogen's part of that story. What do you make of that? And, you know, is this something that's really potentially going to happen in the States? So Nikki, we'll come to you first.
Sure. Actually, that's a really good question. So by talking to the different utility management team, I think the answer we got is it depends on the geography, right? If you are in a state that makes more sense, then probably. But for them, they see it more of to use it to for the natural gas side rather than on the generation side. But for NextEra, obviously, they are hoping to use it on the generation side to replace the natural gas. But then again, in the US, there's a production tax credit for clean hydrogen. So far, the rule hasn't been very favorable. I think they are limited only to new capacity coming online in the last 2 years or something. So existing, so for NextEra, obviously, the new bill would be qualified for that. And then on the nuclear side, most of the nuclear would not be available, would not qualify unless it's uprates, right? New capacity only. So for NextEra, I think they are also talking about the way that it has to be like hourly matching or something. So I think the scale it's probably not gonna be something that you're gonna expect. Like it's gonna be very slow, and it will be very dependent on which region you operate in.
Yeah, it's very interesting because, if you listen to some of the oil companies, there's so much talk about hydrogen. And then you start to say, well, no, wait a second, where's all this hydrogen potentially going to get used? Well, then it's sort of like the idea is maybe it's the utilities. Patricio, I want to just come back to you on the hydrogen question. I think there's maybe two ways to answer it. One is, are any of the utilities really at the point where they're executing real hydrogen projects that would be online 5-10 years, or is it really far out? And then I know a number of companies have often in Europe in particular talked about hydrogen blending into the gas network. Has anybody made any progress on that in the last couple of years?
Sure. So this is in line with European policy, so it's nothing that that's outlandish. But there are a couple of green hydrogen projects, and at this stage of time, because the plan is to 2050. At this stage, we're only seeing pilot projects for industrial use. So we've seen a couple of co-located projects of green hydrogen production here in Spain, for example. Iberdrola has one where they try to produce. They're producing green steel. Basically, they're producing renewable power to produce steel, but this is a pilot stage project. This is still a relatively sort of a drop in the bucket, let's say, versus the ambition over the long run. At least in Spain, the pipeline is to have at least 12 gigawatts of electrolyzers through 2035, and we have less than 500 megawatts at the moment. So that's kind of the scale of the challenge. And I would say that most companies, most large utilities, have actually divested their assets in especially in green fuels and biofuels, not only green hydrogen, but because the demand signals are fairly weak, and these companies, being utilities, having a utility mindset, will not invest heavily into something that is not regulated yet. A lot of these companies are asking for sort of a regulated asset-based model in order to have a guaranteed rate of return. Again, this is part of the plan, but I think the EU Commission or the EU 27 will have or unveil this regulatory framework towards the end of the decade. It will be towards 2027. And that's where I can loop in a company like Enagas, which is the gas transport company here in Spain. Basically, they have cleaned up their balance sheet. They've divested all of their riskier assets to have this balance sheet capacity. And now they are waiting for the new regulatory cycle to begin in 2027 with the hopes that a lot of these hydrogen projects will actually be funded and picked as strategically important projects. And those include the transformation of existing pipelines that transport gas to transport green hydrogen. There's only been a few tests in that front. It seems like it's feasible, but again, actually the mechanics of changing how people consume gas and changing the boilers and changing just basically how you burn the fuel, I think we haven't gotten there yet. There's no testing on that. I think so far they know it's feasible to transport hydrogen instead of gas, but that comes with corrosion issues and other considerations. So I would say it's still in a very, very nascent stage.
It's very interesting to hear about this, and I'm going to sort of mentally place in my head the idea that hydrogen's a relatively expensive fuel type for any sector. And on that point, let's just do a quick commodity check-in. So I'm looking at my screen right now. Henry Hub is sub $3 per MMBTU at the moment, about 280 and change. TTF over in Europe, their sort of most analogous price point is at 41 euros and per megawatt hour and change. I don't think in euros per megawatt hour. So just on a quick conversion, I always have to make sure this is right. That's about $13 per MMBTU. So gas in Europe, very expensive. So I could understand why hydrogen might make a little bit more sense there. But just quickly from you, Pat, before we come back to the States, what kind of progress is being made on gas consumption within the power sector? So I know after Russia invaded Ukraine, all the European policymakers sort of stood up and said, look, we got to get rid of gas use as fast as we can to sort of tamp down on imports that were coming from Russia. Have they made progress on that in utilities, across other sectors? Give me a sense of kind of where European gas usage stands at the moment.
Sure thing. So overall gas demand in Europe is poised to remain relatively flat in 2024 after declining almost 20% from 2021 to 2023. So that's a 20% drop on the back of the energy crisis. And we've seen signs of a recovery in residential consumption, mainly because of weather patterns sort of getting colder after two consecutive warmer than average winters. We've seen a slight pickup in industrial demand, but where the drop has been the most marked or more the steepest has been in gas to power demand. So gas burn in power has decreased significantly by 20% plus in most jurisdictions. Perhaps the exception is the UK and Germany, where their lack of hydro availability means that they need to burn more gas. And again, that's a combination of several factors. So overall power demand remains subdued. So that's one thing to consider, is that structural demand has declined. The other part is that we had lower than average hydro reservoirs during 2022, during the crisis. And since then, we've had really robust hydropower reservoirs in 2023 and 24. So part of that erosion in gas demand comes from hydro, not really from adding wind and solar capacity. But that said, Europe added roughly 66 gigawatts last year of renewables. That's the EU27, and they're poised to add another 70 plus this year. So progress is still being made. Coal phase outs are still on track. So the block is going to close about 16 gigawatts of coal capacity throughout this year. So it's evidence that it is working. But again, the resulting product so far is also that we have relatively higher power prices, sadly. I think that kind of encapsulates the moving pieces. Emissions are down roughly 20%, or we're down 20% in 2023. And we're going to see another drop this year. So in that sense, the policy is working.
Very interesting. So let's bring this over to the States, because I think gas consumption within the power sector has just been on this phenomenal upward trajectory in the States. And gas has been relatively cheap or muted. The price hasn't been that extreme in recent years. But I'm curious, both Nikki and Gabby, I want to get a sense, are regulators concerned about the concentration of sort of asset risk in having maybe like an over-reliance on gas in the power sector in the US? 10, 20 years ago, you used to see this sort of strategy where utility regulators would sort of want a portfolio of options so that you weren't super reliant on any one technology or fuel. I feel like that's maybe gone by the wayside, and everyone sort of just embraced that gas is the default fuel. But give me a sense, Gabby, we'll come to you first. Now, what are the companies you look after doing? What do their portfolios look like? Are they increasingly putting a lot of focus on gas, or is the focus elsewhere? Tell me.
Well, we've seen a lot of the companies in their most recent integrated resource planning with this basically will make them forecast what the load is and therefore see what are the resources that they're going to be needing to meet that demand. And with this increase that we've seen recently, increased demand, many utilities are proposing new power plants fueled by natural gas. Of course, they're also proposing that, to be fair, renewables and battery storage, because all of the states have clean energy goals that they need to meet. But because of the reliability that the natural gas power plants can provide to the utilities, they are proposing new power plants in their new IRPs. So just to mention as an example, in Kentucky, PPL just proposed 2 natural gas power plants of about 900 megawatts And they are seeing a lot of power demand from data centers in that state.
Fascinating. Nikki, let's get your perspective on gas in the power mix in the US.
Yeah, actually, I'll echo Gabby on the reliability concern. If you look at the how the direction we are moving forward, like we try to decarbonize the economy, but even back in 2022, when gas prices went up like what $9 from below $3, gas is still at 40%. Gas shares of the U.S. fuel is still 40%, up from 38.5 in 2021. So it looks like regardless of where the price is, U.S. Is actually consuming more and more gas in power generation. But then in terms of like which region, right? It's also depends on the regulators. Some states are more supportive of gas, some are less. But the trend that Gabby is saying is similar. Like for example, Dominion recently put out a 15-year IRP, right? And 20% of the gas of the generation is actually natural gas. So I think with the robust demand growth, regulators in almost every state started to realize that, okay, reliability is going to be a concern because we're continuing to add all these renewables and retiring the coal plants, but renewables is not reliable, right? So you need to have reliable gas base load there just in case that you have reliability need. So I think the outlook for natural gas in power generation, I think is very positive from this point of view in almost every state. Yeah.
I'm curious about contracting. So in the power sector, often in the past for coal, you would see multi-year long-term contracts cut for coal deliveries and at a certain agreed to price. For renewables, it's very common to sign a multi-year PPA for an agreed upon price. Is anyone cutting multi-year long-term agreements for natural gas delivery into the power sector? Have we seen any companies talk about that, do that?
That's a very good question, but I actually haven't paid much attention to that side. Yeah, sorry.
It's okay. It's okay to not know the answer. I'm just curious.
But I'm sure it probably makes sense in some of the areas, right? Like if you are retiring your coal plants, you're not gonna. It probably would be running for say 5 more years. Then obviously the contract terms will also be different. But no, I haven't really dived in deep into that.
I think part of the issue there might be that so it's sort of a market psychology thing where the coal companies and suppliers were sort of accustomed to that way of doing business. They were happy to sign long-term agreements. In the natural gas space, I think that there's sort of this desire almost from the players in the industry to have exposure to the spot market or more real-time market. And so this idea of long-term contract is more of a sort of foreign concept. So it might not, I feel like long-term contracts are sort of quite a comfortable idea in utility land. I'm not so sure that the natural gas suppliers feel the same way. So I did mention at the earlier in the call that we'd circle back around on the PJM capacity markets. I do want to talk about that because I personally find that to be pretty interesting. So for anyone who's listening who's not a power analyst or sort of deep on power markets, power is very interesting. So you have the wholesale electricity price in certain regions where it's traded, and that's basically for the energy only, the electrons. But then some markets, not all of them, have capacity markets as well. So that's where you're essentially paying for the power plant to exist and be available. And Nikki, you mentioned that prices in the PJM capacity market had surged 10x. That's a big number. 10x is a lot. Can you explain kind of what happened, what's going on? Is this an enduring thing? Give me your read on how our clients should be interpreting such a big increase in the capacity price there in PJM.
So I think it's a supply and demand, right? So it looks like the supply forecast is seeing I forgot the exact percentage increase, a robust increase, right? But then I think the reliability, because when you provide the capacity, you need to be committed. Like when your capacity is called, then you have to deliver. I think it was in 2022 that there was some producers that actually got penalized for not able to deliver. So demand was lower in the last auction, and then supply was actually higher because everyone is expecting the demand and the supply shortfall. So the price went up. And then for the outlook, it probably would be similar just because it takes time to build a power plant. Even like for example, if you build a natural gas power plant, depends on where you are, but from most of the utility, they were saying if you are starting from the scratch to building, it takes 5 to 6 years. So so it looks like if there are no new supply coming in, you could expect the price continue to stay high. And that's why PJM actually has an auction in early December, but they were, because a lot of people were complaining, I think a lot of the consumer groups were challenging that the capacity price, auction price was so high, so they wanted to delay the next auction. So but from the industry point of view is that unless there's some supply coming up or some rule changes, likely the price will stay pretty high.
Yeah, very interesting. It's sort of signaling to the market, build dispatchable
new
capacity.
Build. Exactly.
That's how I interpret it.
Exactly. That's the whole purpose of the capacity auction, to send the market new build signal. Yeah.
And give me a quick sense. You don't have to go into any detail, but do wind and solar even bid into the capacity market? Can they count in that? And what about demand response? How does it feed in?
All of them do build into the market. Yeah. So I don't know the exact calculation of like they have a firm supply, how you convert into the capacity, but yeah, they do. Okay. And then I think if the capacity price is high enough, more demand response will try to bid in, right?
Yep. Very interesting. Okay, so let's we've already run over a little bit, but let's just close out with a sort of big picture thematic question. And so we are less than 1 week from the US election. I think very different visions have been laid out for how Republican Donald Trump would approach energy versus Democrat Kamala Harris. And so I'm curious we're just going to do a quick round robin. Gabby, we'll come to you first. Can you tell me what is what's your sense? You know, does the election really matter for utilities, or is it just some kind of thing that's happening in the background and utilities just kind of march on? So frame it. How important is the election?
No, of course it is important. And I think we just have to think about it like the utilities are regulated by the states, right? So a lot of the state regulations won't necessarily change because of who is sitting on the presidential chair, right? However, if it has all, like historically, like if we have a blue president, like renewables usually get more support, and if we don't, then the renewables get less support, which I guess that could perhaps have some impact. But and then of course we have the Inflation Reduction Act, which I know you, Rob, and Nikki, and Patricia have like spoken several times. But yes, they do have, it will have an impact, but I don't think it will be as meaningful as it could be for other industries.
Real quick before we wrap up, by the way, on that point, next week's version of this call, so next Wednesday, 10 a.m., we will be having our standard call. We have Nathan Dean planning to join us. He's our senior policy analyst in Washington, D.C. So we'll hear from him in real time, kind of how to interpret the election results. I have a feeling that maybe at 10 a.m. next Wednesday, we may not know who's won the election, but let's see. Okay, over to you, Nikki. Though I'm saying broad question. How important is the election for your companies?
I'll echo what Gabby mentioned. A lot of the utility the investment decision is driven at the state level, but the Inflation Reduction Act definitely makes a huge difference. But then again, also who is going to be the FERC chair, right? Because the new president can probably change a different FERC chair. And then you also have something like executive decision. Like, for example, there's a new rule about natural gas, new bill. If it's more than 39%, you need to have carbon capture. These are the rules that makes a huge difference on the new bill generation. So this will probably be a few things that on top of my mind that would be very relevant.
Very interesting. Okay, and Patricio, last comment over to you. What are you watching for in the U.S. election? How's it, potentially going to impact some of the companies you cover?
Sure, I think mainly just I think the main risk is the Inflation Reduction Act or any changes to the provisions or anything sort of swaying in the direction of the Inflation Reduction Act. But we don't think that the risk there is very big, just because it tends to take a long time to change those type of policies, and it was a bipartisan bill, and we know that it's brought perhaps more benefits in the manufacturing side that will be I think a hard thing to change for either of the presidents, although there will be a headline risk, I think, for renewable power developers if there's a red wave, and that's mainly, I think, where we do think there's a plausible or like a feasible risk. Real risk is for offshore wind, just given that if President Trump is elected, he could set a moratorium for new federal permits, and that would curve the pipeline of projects quite significantly. There's roughly 40 gigawatts of projects that are in different stages of development. Some won't be commissioned until the 2040s, but around 40 gigawatts, and only six and a half are already have those federal permits. So if there's a moratorium there would be a delay, or that could sort of hurt the recovery in offshore wind, and European developers are very much exposed on that front.
Okay, well, I think we're going to have to leave it there. It's always so fun. We always have more to talk about than we can really get to in we're supposed to only go in a half hour, but we always end up talking a little bit longer, and partially that's because you stick with us. But if we didn't get to any questions that you had on your mind, every single one of us is a green dot on the terminal right now. So just shoot us an IB, shoot us an email if that's how you prefer to communicate, or reach out and schedule some time to speak to any one of us. We're happy to follow up with you individually if you have more detailed questions that we didn't have time to discuss here on the call. And again, look forward to being in touch next Wednesday. We'll do our best to unpack the election with Nathan Dean and some of the other folks on the team. So take care, everyone. See you next week.